Okay, hi folks. Welcome to our first weekly um, video lecture, lesson, whatever you want to call it, for online U.S. government. I'm again thrilled that you all are in the course and that folks are starting, and that's great. Please be sure, if you have not already done so, please return the course agreement page. That is really essential that we have that signed by you yourself and a parent or guardian. If you are already 18, please, if at all possible, have that signed by a parent or former guardian. Just these people care about whether you graduate, and if there's an issue, then I need to be able to point to the document and say, well, here's where it says that you can't kill squirrels or whatever, and they were killing squirrels or what have you. I'm just making up a stupid example. All right, so today we are this next couple of weeks we are talking about sort of the origins of American government, and this is in chapters 1 and 2 in your McGraw-Hill government textbook. But I'm calling this How America Becomes America, or Became America. Where did independence and the Constitution come from? Because this is kind of our foundations of government, section, unit, whatever we want to call it. Okay, so probably the earliest influence on the American system is probably from 500 BC, and that is the city-state of Athens, which is in Greece. This was the first bigger scale example of a democratic system. Now, like later democracies, this was sort of limited democracy. For example, you could be a citizen if you were a woman, but you weren't really allowed to vote, and you couldn't sit in the assembly or whatever. So fundamentally, most of the decisions were made by men, as it will be later on when we start the United States. There were also in Athens, so they had about 100,000 citizens. They had 10,000 what we would think of as resident aliens, people from another place that are living in Athens. Athens was kind of a big draw because of its democratic system, enlightened ideas, and relative prosperity. Although obviously Athens was just one city-state in Greece, there were others like Sparta and whatnot. And then there are about 150,000 slaves. Bear in mind that most of Athens had zero rights. If you were a slave, if you were a resident alien, you had no rights. And really, if you were a woman, you were a citizen. But again, you really didn't get to exercise those rights. There were really about 40,000 people that made decisions, or what former President Bush might call deciders, in that system. So Athens, first example of democracy, but again, highly, highly limited example of democracy. And incidentally, slaves in Athens were not necessarily people of different races. Oftentimes they were poor people who were enslaved to someone and could maybe work to earn their freedom. Things like that. It was a different slavery than what we had in the United States later on. But a lot of our system is highly influenced by the English/British system that a lot of them, the first Americans, white Americans, were truly familiar with. And so one of these influences obviously was the Magna Carta, which was written and signed in 1215, signed by King John. And the Magna Carta was the first real limit on the power of the king. Prior to the Magna Carta, the king ruled with really absolute authority. Now, after the Magna Carta, the king will rule with slightly less than absolute authority, but still be very, very important in the day-to-day governing of, at this point, England. All right, but the Magna Carta enumerated for the first time rights that people had sort of collectively. So, for one thing, that the church would be separate-ish from the government. Now, eventually, the government will become very involved with something called the Church of England. After Henry VIII decides that he doesn't want to be Catholic anymore because the Catholics are really opposed to that whole divorce thing and remarrying younger and younger women thing. So he basically says, peace out, yo, I'm starting my own church, which was largely like the Catholic Church, but, without, without those things. So the right to own and inherit property. Up to this point, all property was basically the king's. And now there was a at least limited right for other wealthy people. These weren't so much rights for average, everyday workers, peasants. These were more rights for nobility. But again, first limit on the rights of a king. That's pretty cool. So owning and inheriting property, protection from excessive taxation. So the first limits on the king being able to just directly tax because he feels like it. And due process and equality before the law. All people were equal before the law, except really the king at this point. But beyond that, the law was not supposed to, at least, play favorites again amongst the aristocracy. Again, if you were a peasant, the law still was not necessarily your friend. Incidentally, in this picture, doesn't King John look kind of pissed? Anyway, the Petition of Right was the next thing. So Magna Carta was in the 1200s. This is all the way in the 1600s. We're now into the Enlightenment, and the Petition of Right was another limit on the monarch. This one, no taxation without the consent of Parliament. At this point, Parliament didn't even have all of it necessarily its rights. But one thing that Parliament could do was kind of say yes or no to taxes. No imprisonment without charge. If you were thrown in jail, you had to be charged with a crime. And that's definitely gets inherited by the United States system, eventually the American system. You are supposed to be charged with a crime in order to be thrown in jail. Now, famously, for example, Abraham Lincoln sort of skirts this particular right, this protection, during the Civil War. Franklin Roosevelt sort of gets around this with interning Japanese Americans. There are some that would say that President Trump is trying to get around these things when dealing with immigrants. Again, you're welcome to draw your own conclusion with that, but that is what some people are saying. No soldiers quartered in private homes. This will be something that becomes very, very important to the settlers in the New World when that, because this is already happening when this is written, that eventually the British will start to try to quarter soldiers in private homes, and the colonists are going to go, hey, wait a minute, we're not supposed to have to do that. We're Englishmen, and Parliament basically says, yeah, but you left, so we can do whatever we want to you. And the colonists eventually go, no, I don't think so. And no martial law, so martial law is rule by the military. No martial law during peacetime. And this is, again, something that very much shows up in the American system. The military is not supposed to be called out into the streets to dispense justice, such as it is, for domestic crimes. It's supposed to. There we go. The English Bill of Rights, so a few years later, another document is signed, and this one creates some semblance of the constitutional monarchy that we are more familiar with today in the British system. Sets up a real constitutional monarchy So the people have the freedom, well, the upper class people, I think it was the landowners still at this point, had the freedom to elect representatives to Parliament without the king going, no, you're going to be represented by this guy. Instead, he's my buddy. No, that's not okay. Freedom of speech in Parliament. What members of Parliament said could not then be punished by the king. You couldn't say that you dislike the king and all of a sudden the king is trying to throw you in jail or something. That's not okay. Freedom from royal interference with laws. So the king, who was kind of the executive here, was not allowed to, they could sign laws, I think they could veto laws, but they couldn't just change the law because. There had to be some sort of rule of law that was independent of the king. The right to petition the king. Ordinary Britons, although really the aristocracy, were allowed to tell the king, hey, this is wrong, why don't you fix it? Right to bear arms for self-defense. This obviously plays into the American system with the Second Amendment to the Constitution. Freedom from cruel and unusual punishments or excessive bails. This is also written into the Bill of Rights. So this one translates to the U.S. system. King cannot raise taxes without the consent of Parliament, so Parliament has to vote on tax increases. Theoretically, that is the case with the American system as well. Theoretically. No fines or forfeiture without a trial. So if you're charged with crime, you need to have a trial before you are punished. Again, this does make its way into the American system, theoretically. And then finally, no raising of armies during peacetime. So this is an extension of no martial law. If you're not at war, you don't get to have an army. Now this kind of started out in the American system, and then the 20th century happened, and now we do keep a standing army. Not saying that's good or bad, but it has sort of evolved over the years. But again, you're not supposed to be using the military to dispense civilian law. Supposed to. Okay, so in addition to those lovely documents, we also have philosophical influences on this. And the first one is something that the American system is really trying to get away from when it's founded, and that is the divine right of kings. So there was a time period in Europe especially where the belief was that the king was the king, and at this point they were almost always kings, simply because God had decided it was going to be so. God had blessed this particular family to rule over this group of people, and it's what God wanted, so that's what it's going to be. I don't know if that sounds fishy to anybody else, but yeah, that I think was trying to convince a more simple populace that, the king is the king because. And you don't question that, that's just the way it is. So one of the first people that's going to sort of argue against this, is a guy named Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was writing in the late 1500s, early 1600s. He dies in 1679, lives a heck of a long life, really. And he writes his sort of masterwork known as the Leviathan, which the Leviathan is like this big, strong, angry creature. Okay? And so to Hobbes rejects the divine right of kings. He says the king isn't the king because God wanted it to be so. The king is the king for other reasons. The king is the king because people need to be protected from themselves. Okay, if you leave things up to the masses, then you're going to have chaos. You need a strong ruler, and Hobbes believed needed a strong ruler. Okay, not necessarily this parliament business, but I think he was okay with that. But you need a strong ruler to tell the people what they really want. So in the Leviathan, he says that in a state of nature, okay, there is no government and life is bad. The quote is, in nature, life is it cruel, brutish, and short? I know brutish and short is the end of it, but I forget the first part. I think it's cruel, brutish, and short. So if you have too much freedom, you're going to be miserable, basically. So the default setting for life in this is to be solitary, to be poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So that in a state of nature, your life is going to be solitary, you are going to be poor, and your life is going to be nasty, brutish, and short. Period. And so people, in order to protect against that sort of thing, people need strong rulers to guard them from themselves and help, raise them up a little bit. And you shouldn't question that ruler. If he's strong, that's the only thing that matters. And people should surrender their will to the state, and in return, the state saves people from anarchy, saves people from the nasty, brutish, and short, essentially. Yeah? And keep in mind, Hobbes was writing all this stuff, and his big influence was the English Civil War, which was not a nice conflict. It really was not a positive time in England. I mean, they were basically getting rid of a king, and there was basically this was like the time period of Oliver Cromwell. Incidentally, if you want to know more about Oliver Cromwell, look up Monty Python Oliver Cromwell song on like YouTube. I had a friend who took a class on English history and had to write about Oliver Cromwell, and she said that song actually helped her pass an essay. So I always recommend it, but I can't play it for you now because I would get content blocked on the YouTubes. So anyway, Hobbes was writing during the English Civil War, and that very much influenced him, seemingly. But certainly more important to the American system, the idealized American system, I should say, Thomas Hobbes really represents kind of what America becomes later on. And some might argue even what America is becoming today. Some. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying there is that. But the guy that influences sort of America's idealized existence to a lot of people, including people like Thomas Jefferson, was a guy named John Locke. So Locke was writing later than Hobbes. He writes from the early middle part of he's alive from the early middle part of the 1600s to the early 1700s. So he does not live as long as Hobbes does. But his major work, and there are several, but his big one is called Two Treatises of Government. And to Locke says that people don't just have the rights that government gives them. People have natural rights that are given to them by God, that God gave them to Adam, and Adam passed them down. Okay, the right to be free comes from nature, and that government is a social contract between the people and leaders to protect life, liberty, and property. Now, Locke and Hobbes actually would have agreed with that, but to Hobbes, you had to surrender your freedom to get that protection. Locke is saying you shouldn't have to surrender your freedoms, and you certainly don't have to surrender your natural rights in order to gain that protection for life, liberty, and property. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Life, liberty, and property? We'll talk about it in a minute. And it's the job of the government, according to Locke, to protect life, liberty, and property. Okay? If the government fails to do that job, according to Locke, People have the right, nay, the responsibility, to overthrow that government and start a new one that does protect those things. Now, Locke is writing during the Glorious Revolution, when the monarchy is restored to England after Cromwell, and I think there was an attempt to put Cromwell's son on a throne-ish thing, and that really didn't work. Really, look into Cromwell. Cromwell's fascinating. But anyway, we don't have time for that right now. So the Glorious Revolution was mostly bloodless. So whereas Hobbes is writing at the height of the English Civil War, this very, very bloody conflict, Locke is writing during this sort of enlightened, hey, we're bringing back the king, woo, kind of a deal. So they were ousting the remnants of Cromwell and bringing on a new king and queen who were supposed to set England, later Britain, on the right course. So that's Locke. Here's a couple little sort of visuals, if that's your bag. You can certainly take a screenshot of these if it helps you. So they are similar in that the original state of humankind is the state of nature. They both agree on that. And both agree that there's no divine right of kings, that it's a social contract. Now, the difference is in how those two things are set about, right? So remember that Hobbes said that people set up governments, and monarchs or whoever set up governments to protect the people from themselves. Whereas Locke is saying that governments are set up to protect natural rights, life, liberty, property, right? Just keep that in mind, life, liberty, property. And the sovereignty, Hobbes would say that the power resides in the monarch, that the people surrender their rights, surrender their powers, so that the monarch can make them safe. Locke, on the other hand, is saying, the real power's in the people. There's way more of them than there are the monarch. There's one monarch, maybe a royal family, so, 10, 20. There's thousands and, potentially millions of people. The power really is with the people if the people will believe that. Therein lies the difficulty. Can the government's power be limited? Hobbes says no. The government's power is absolute. You obey the government right? And Locke is saying, yes, absolutely, we need to limit the power of government because the government represents the people, and, even people have to have their power checked. So there are limits to the government's power. And do people, if the government is not protecting their natural rights, do people have the right of revolution? Hobbes says absolutely not. The king's the king. He is the powerful one, and he's going to protect you. And Locke's going to say, heck no, if the government's not working, throw it out. Start a new one. Don't let the government just not work. Now, this is going to lead directly to the Declaration of Independence. Now, Jefferson wrote the original draft. He cribs a ton of John Locke. He doesn't really credit him so much, but, back then there wasn't really citations on stuff like this. But Jefferson writes it, cribbing a lot of Locke. But remember, too, that when you're reading the Declaration of Independence, and I recommend it, it's not a long document. It does have a lot of very interesting vocabulary in it that you might have to look up some words. But keep in mind that this document underwent a couple of weeks of revision by the Continental Congress. And parts of it that Jefferson wrote actually were taken out. Jefferson had written a stern rebuke of slavery into the document that almost scuttled the entire independence thing. The southern states walk out. And Jefferson, was a southerner himself. He was from Virginia, which is sort of northern South. But Jefferson, and again, Jefferson's really weird on this, because on the one hand he's saying, yeah, slavery's bad. On the other hand, he owned slaves. I mean, he fathered children with one of his slaves. Yeah, Jefferson's a really mixed up dude. But he writes beautifully. But just bear in mind, not all of it is Jefferson. A lot of it, in fact, Jefferson was kind of frustrated with the end document because they had taken out so much of what he had written to add other things to not be so controversial. Okay, so the Declaration of Independence is there, and the revolution has already begun. The shot heard around the world comes in 1775. We declare independence in 1776. And then in 1781, the Continental Congress at that point is going to put in motion something called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were written in 1777, but not adopted till 1781. And they'll eventually be replaced by the U.S. Constitution in 1789. So these things last like 8 years, and at least 4 years in, people are going, wow, this ain't working. So just in a nutshell, the Articles of Confederation said there was only one branch of government. Congress was it. There was no president. There was a president of Congress, but they really couldn't do anything. There was no judiciary per se. There were courts in the states, but there wasn't like a federal judiciary to interpret laws and see that they conform. So, there's just the one branch, Congress, and yeah, that in and of itself is highly unworkable. Each state only got one vote, so there were 13 states. There were big states like New York and Virginia. There were small states like Rhode Island and Connecticut. They all got the same one vote. And so, and most votes either had to have 9 of 13 agree or unanimous. 13 of 13 agree. So, little Rhode Island could scuttle an entire initiative just by saying, no, we don't like that. And Rhode Island was particularly sort of cantankerous on most issues. There was no national currency. The states were coming up with their own currencies. Some places were still using the British pound. No power to collect taxes. The federal government, or the national government, I should say, it wasn't federal. The national government could not collect taxes. They could request money from the states. Request. The states could say, no, not going to do that. And many of them did. So the national government really couldn't do anything. They couldn't deal with national crises. They were dealing with the war, but beyond war, they really couldn't agree on much. They couldn't even agree to handle regional crises. Things like Shays' Rebellion Shays' Rebellion almost got out of hand and scuttled the entire country because Massachusetts go, we can't handle this by ourselves. Help us, please. And the states around it are going, we're busy. We're having pancakes. So, no, we're not going to come. Massachusetts very nearly went under because of Shays' Rebellion. Ultimately, they were able to get it under control. But, imagine, let's say Montana is hit by a hurricane. All right. And I know that's impossible, but bear with me. And our state government just can't handle everything. We weren't prepared for a hurricane. And so in our modern system, we are supposed to have things to assist us. In addition to National Guard that can be called from other states, we have things like the Federal Emergency Management Agency right now that can help us with things. They didn't have anything like that under the Articles. There was no executive branch to enforce law. There was no judicial branch to review the laws and resolve disputes. This thing was a nightmare. And it's under that folks like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton are going to start calling for, hey, we need to revise the Articles. In actuality, most of them are going, we got to scrap these dang things and put in something better. So they're going to call a convention. States are going to send delegates, including people like George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, etc. And they are going to try to replace. They're going to close the doors saying, we're going to amend the articles. And they close the doors to the public and go, yeah, we're getting rid of these dang things. And that's what's going to end up happening. We're going to stop there, but before we go, you do have a reflection journal in Moodle that you need to find out or fill out, answer, respond. And the topic is right here. The topic is not going to be in the journal prompt. It's just going to say respond to the topic from the video. So you got to watch. So in at least 3 sentences, describe at least one of the influences that we talked about that led to the American government we know today, kind of. And how does the American system reflect the influence of that particular document, person, event, etc. Okay, so that's your topic. That's your thing you're writing about. Describe one of the influences that led to the American government we know. Don't just name it, tell me about it. That's what description is. Describe is not just bleh. It's telling me about something. Okay, when you see describe in this class, English class, science class, wherever, you know you need to be writing a little bit, explaining things. If I want you to list something, I'll just say list. Okay? Good rule of thumb. And how does the American system reflect the influence of that person, that document, whatever? Okay? Whatever you're writing about. How does the American government reflect that? All right. Thank you all for paying attention. I really appreciate it. See you next week. And I will be posting things in the course during that time, things to aid you. But remember, chapters 1 and 2 this week, next week, and then we're going to test during next week as well because, unfortunately, we really can't stop moving. We got to keep moving. I'm sorry. It's just we have so much to cover, and it's only a semester-long class. I don't know why that is, but it is. So there we go. Thank you so much for paying attention. I appreciate it. Have a great day.